Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to our Return to Work webinar. So by the end of this session, we hope to have given you the tools you need to manage your people back to work over the next few weeks. Now, all workplaces have been able to start to return as from the 1st of August, but that's provided that they have a COVID-19 safety measure in place, i.e. a risk assessment and any PPE required. But you and your managers need to know how to deal with a variety of other things that returning to work may throw at you as well. I will be recording the session today and I will provide you with a copy of this afterwards, which will include the slides and also a handy return to work checklist that you can use or you can distribute to your team. As Lisa's already mentioned, if you do have any questions throughout the webinar, please do post them on the chat and we will return to them at the end of the session. So let's get started. Excuse me. The aim of this session is to give you all some key points of information to assist you to support your employees back to work. So today we're going to be covering absences, so what to do if someone is off sick with COVID-19 symptoms and how to manage your absence triggers. We're going to cover the test and trace system, so what is it and what should you do if an employee is contacted by test and trace. We'll be looking at shielding, so we'll be updating you on those employees who have been shielding and are now looking at returning to work and what you need to do for them. Quarantine, so what are the rules on employees returning from abroad? What do we do about those reluctant employees, those ones who are too scared to come back or who have childcare issues or just don't want to come back because they're enjoying themselves in their gardens at the moment on furlough? And also home working, so what do you need to consider for the future of home working if you are looking at that as a more permanent thing? Contract variations for when you need to reduce hours or you need to change working patterns. And lastly, we'll be looking a little bit into restructure and redundancy. So what happens when, unfortunately, you do need to make those cuts? So we're going to start off with absence. Main symptoms of COVID-19, and I'm sure you've probably heard them all a million times before, but just to recap, the main symptoms of COVID-19 are high temperature, so you are hot to touch on your chest or back. You do not have to take your temperature to have a high temperature, it's just with you are hot to touch on your chest or back. A new continuous cough. Now that's defined as coughing a lot for more than an hour or 3 or more coughing episodes in 24 hours. And a loss or change to your sense of smell or taste. So you can't smell or taste anything or things smell or taste very different. If any employee is displaying any of these symptoms, they must self-isolate for a period of 10 days. And anyone in their household or their support bubble must self-isolate for 14 days. If their symptoms don't persist beyond this time, or if the cough or the smell and taste changes remain, but they haven't worsened, they can then return to work. Please check in with your employees a couple of days before they're due back, find out how they are and discuss their return to work. In addition to self-isolating, anyone who has any of the 3 symptoms can now arrange a test, and this can be done within the first 5 days of displaying symptoms. Please ask them to visit the Please ask them to visit the NHS website and they can arrange a test there, and tests can either be done at a testing centre or they can apply for a home testing kit. Now the tests on site can take up to about 72 hours to come back. The home testing kits obviously depend a little bit on the person actually sending them back swiftly. If your employee does manage to get their test results back before that 10-day isolation period has gone through and that test is negative, they are able to then return to work at that point, provided that no one they live with or no one in their support bubble has symptoms. So if they are negative and their household and support bubble are symptom-free, they can return as soon as they receive that negative test. Again, we suggest you follow up with your employees to ensure that they've arranged their test and also again to then discuss the results and their return to work. Now, obviously, if they are still feeling a little bit ill, it might be wise to remain off work so they don't go passing bugs around to their colleagues. At present, employees who have to self-isolate because they or someone in their household or support bubble has symptoms are still eligible for statutory sick pay from day 1 of their absence. That rule has not changed just because we are returning people to the workplace. We recommend that you ask them to obtain a self-isolation note from the NHS 111 online service to validate their absence. And we're going to provide you with a handy checklist at the end, as I've already said, and that will include a couple of useful websites for you and for your employees to visit. Now, you may need to make some adjustments to your absence management policy, so specifically triggers for absences and how you escalate that to disciplinary proceedings. It really wouldn't be appropriate to include COVID-19 related absences in an absence management process. You don't want your employees that have symptoms coming to work because they're terrified of facing a disciplinary or losing their job. This would obviously put people at unnecessary risk. Where an employee is absent due to COVID-19, we recommend you keep a record of the absence and you carry out your normal return to work procedures. So that should be ideally a return to work meeting. But when you're looking at reviewing your absence trigger points, you would discount those absences from the process. We have also developed a COVID-19 absence policy, and if you would like a copy of that, please let us know on the chat and we'll arrange to get one to you. Please also remember to be considerate of other illnesses. So because we've all been isolating in our homes, we've not been out and about as much, we've all been kept away from the usual cold, flu and stomach bugs that make the rounds. Our immune systems are likely to be very lowered, and it's highly likely that you'll see much higher sickness absence rates for a while. Please do encourage your employees to take time off to recover and avoid passing germs around the office. Do follow your procedures for managing absence, but again, don't take this into account if you are looking at your absence triggers and whether to move for a formal dismissal. You may have employees who have lost family members or friends as well during this time, and that could be either due to COVID or due to something else. And returning to normal and coming back to the office might trigger a bit more grief and distress for them, and they'll need some time to come to terms with what's happening. But make sure you are there to support them, and again, be sensitive to this when reviewing your absence triggers. This has been a really difficult period for most people in a variety of ways, and it's highly likely that you may come across employees who are struggling with their mental health. Now, please don't be afraid to ask them, how are you? And to offer your support to them. There are lots of ways you can support employees through periods of poor mental health, but if they do need time off, it's really important that they don't feel pressured by potential warnings. And it's also equally important that you stay in touch with them and take steps to help them maintain the routine of work. Statistically, we know that people who are absent for long periods of time due to mental health problems are less likely to return to the workplace, so it's really important that you keep in touch. I've already mentioned the tests that are available for those displaying COVID-19 symptoms. If that test returns a positive result, the NHS Test and Trace service becomes involved, and they will ask you for details of anyone you've had close recent contact with, so anyone you've been within 2 meters of, essentially. They will then contact all those individuals. And if you have an employee who is contacted by the Test and Trace service, the procedure is that they get alerted by the Test and Trace service, usually via an email or a text message, and they are asked to log on to the NHS website for a review. They will be told to isolate for 14 days, but this is from the last day of contact with the person who tested positive. This isn't from the point where the NHS service contact them. It's from the last day of contact from the person who tested positive. But then you've been to a restaurant 3 days ago and you get contacted by the Test and Trace because your waitress has had symptoms, you would isolate for 14 days from 3 days previous. As I've already mentioned, this would be on statutory sick pay for any period that they can't attend work. Now, they may get a notification from the Test and Trace service that they can use as proof of absence, but if not, again, please ask them to complete that self-isolation note from the NHS website. They'll also then be told to get a test if they develop symptoms. And if that test is negative, they still have to complete their 14-day isolation period before they can return to work. And this is just down to the incubation periods for symptoms. Again, we suggest you keep a record of any of these absences, but you don't count them towards your absence triggers, and just be guided by the Test and Trace service ultimately as to how you proceed. Most of those who have been shielding, so the people that are in the most vulnerable of categories, were able to return to work on the 1st of August. I mean, just because the government says that they can return to work, it doesn't mean that they are going to want to. Okay, they've been shielding for a reason, they're obviously vulnerable and they may be very worried about this. So what are your options with employees who have been shielding? Now, obviously, if they can still work from home, it might be a good idea to allow them to do that for as long as you can. But if you can't do that, then what you do next depends on what you have done with them during their period of shielding. So it depends whether they were on furlough or whether they were on statutory sick pay. If they were on statutory sick pay, that entitlement ended on the 31st of July. So unless their GP signs them off as unfit to return to work, they will either need to return or they'll need to take some unpaid leave or use some of their annual leave. If you had them on furlough specifically because they were shielding, that eligibility also ended on the 31st of July, as the reason for the furlough will no longer be there. And again, you'll need to explore those other options. However, if you have furloughed them for other reasons as well, such as childcare or because there is a genuine lack of work, they can remain on furlough or on flexible furlough where they can work part-time until the scheme ends in October. So plan ahead and start that conversation with your employees who have been shielding if you haven't already. And this also applies to people who've been caring for someone who is shielding as well, because they are naturally going to be a lot more wary about coming back. So discuss a plan for a safe and effective return to the workplace. This is where your return to work meeting will be crucial. Those who've been shielding will have probably been more socially isolated than most, so they may have poor mental health. They may feel overwhelmed and unsafe to return to the workplace, and they're probably going to be worried about catching the virus. So talk their concerns through. Share your COVID-19 risk assessment with them. And then you might even need to amend that risk assessment to cover your shielding employees and add any extra measures that they need to keep them safe. Remember also that it's highly likely that employees who have been told to shield will be classed as disabled, so they will be protected under the Equality Act, and you are obliged to consider any reasonable adjustments to help them return to work. So if they have to take public transport to work and back, consider how you can help them with this, because they might be reluctant to get on that bus. And there's lots of other examples such as those. Ultimately, we're not medical professionals, so do encourage your employees to consult with their medical team if they're still worried, as their medical team will be best placed to offer full support. I'm sure you'll all remember that the quarantine rules seemed to be lifted as soon as they were imposed back in June. But now we're facing new quarantine rules. So when does quarantine apply? Well, for anyone entering the UK, the rules are that they must self-isolate for 14 days unless they are travelling from one of the following. So that's within the common travel areas, so that's Ireland, Channel Islands or Isle of Man, if they're coming from British overseas territories, or if they're on one of the countries on the approved list. Now, this list is quite long and it does change on a day-to-day basis. There is a list available on the government website, and there are countries being removed and added to that list every single day. It's been in the news recently that Spain is no longer on that list. We know now that people returning from Spain have to quarantine. Luxembourg and Belgium were also removed off that list last week, and it's highly anticipated that France is going to be removed from that list shortly too. So it may be possible anyone going to France over the next few weeks will have to quarantine. Naturally, this caused a lot of worry for employers, because employees may have already booked and paid for holidays to Spain or France or wherever, and are now facing the prospect of having to quarantine for a further 14 days after their holiday. We've been asked a lot if employers can cancel their employees' holiday if they are intending to travel to an area that is not on the safe list. The answer to that is legally yes. So under the working time regulations, Regulation 15, an employer can cancel pre-approved holiday by giving enough notice. And that is notice that is equal to the length of the holiday period. So if your employee has got a week booked off, you have to give them a week's notice to cancel. But if your employee has already paid for their travel and accommodation, this could cause a huge problem. You might be liable to reimburse them for their costs, and your employee may put in a grievance, or could even argue that you've breached the implied terms of trust and confidence, resign and claim constructive dismissal. This is not an approach that we would recommend. If you are in a position that your employee does need to quarantine, what do you need to pay them for that period of quarantine? Well, government guidance has been updated on this. The guidance now expressly states that those quarantining from abroad are not eligible for statutory sick pay unless they start displaying symptoms or someone in their household displays symptoms. We recommend that you talk to your employee about their holiday plans. Can they work from home on their return so that they can quarantine and keep working for you? Can they rearrange their travel plans? So a conversation with their travel agent or travel insurance might be useful. Can they take additional holiday to cover the 14-day isolation? And that might work in your favour because it means they also have less holiday to take or carry forward into next year. Can they take unpaid leave? Is there a way you can pay them for this time and then maybe get them to make the time up throughout the next couple of months, depending on how many hours they work? So we recommend discussing all the options and try to reach a suitable agreement that won't penalise the employee unnecessarily. It's quite likely that you're going to be facing a range of objections from employees about returning to work, and you may have already been experiencing some of them. The biggest one of these will be employees feeling nervous, anxious, or scared to return to the workplace. It's really important to make sure you carry out a return to work meeting with every employee so you can discuss their concerns, alleviate them where possible, and come up with a plan of action if they're still not convinced. Now, if you've got very large teams, you can of course do this as a team meeting to a certain degree, or you can do it as individual meetings. Your return to work meeting should cover things such as, how do they feel about returning? Are they anxious? Are they excited? Discussing the safety measures that you've put in place for them, so that COVID-19 risk assessment again. Be specific about what you are doing to keep them safe, what they need to do themselves to keep themselves safe, and how they raise concerns if those safety procedures aren't being carried out. Have they got any other issues that are making them reluctant to return, such as childcare, not wanting to take public transport, a sick relative? What have they missed about being in work, and what have they enjoyed about being at home? So encouraging them to think positively about their return and their experience over the past few months. How is their mental health? And more importantly, how will they tell you if they are not okay? Everyone needs handling differently, so make sure your team feel comfortable opening up to you if they have a problem. And also discuss the plans for the future. So your team are likely to feel nervous about the future of the business. Reassure them where possible, discuss plans for the future and getting back to full operations. But please do be honest with your team. If you are going to have to consider making redundancies and cuts, please don't tell them that everything's going to be fine and then spring it on them next month. Be honest that things are difficult and that you are considering all your options. At the moment, if your employee still has childcare issues because the school or nursery isn't open, they're still eligible to remain on furlough, and you will need to discuss this with them and try to reach an agreement. Once you've gone through all of this with your employee, so you've offered them support, you've showed them how you'll keep them safe, you've dealt with any objections, and you've agreed on a return to work plan, they should feel much less anxious about coming back. If you are still having problems after this though, please do reach out to us or to another HR support for some guidance, because there are a few different options for resolving that. Now, we know that home working has increased by a massive 38% throughout COVID. Employers who never considered it an option before have been forced to embrace the concept of home working. And you might find your employees have got used to working from home, or maybe they prefer the work-life balance that their recent flexibility has given them, in which case you might get some flexible working requests. Now, everyone has the right to apply for flexible working, provided they have 26 weeks service. But they should explain in their request why they want to change their working pattern or location and how they feel this will impact on themselves, their workload, and the team as a whole. You should consider these requests carefully, but you can say no, provided you have a legitimate business reason for doing so. We're massive advocates for flexible working, and we encourage our clients to be as flexible as work allows. But there's also a place for having people come together as part of a team. Having everyone work from home constantly can create its own challenges. Many business owners have their own reservations about allowing employees to work from home, and these usually centre around trust. How do I know they're not just watching Netflix all day? So do take some time to consider your employees' request in full. Take a quick review of how working from home has impacted them during the past few weeks. Were they productive? Did they stay in touch? Did you feel confident that work was getting done? If they've been rubbish and they've not been doing those things, it's probably not a good idea to allow them to work from home as a long-term thing. But if they've met those or exceeded those requirements, why not consider a more permanent arrangement? If you do agree to a home working arrangement, you'll need to make sure you carry out a home working risk assessment and also come to an agreement on equipment. So who's going to provide it? Who's going to pay for it? Who owns it? You'll also need to look at security of data and any monitoring or check-ins or attendance at the office that you expect. Ultimately, both you and your employee need to feel comfortable with whatever you agree on. Whenever you need to change the terms of an employee's contract, you must follow a fair process. This includes notifying the employee of the proposed changes and the reasons behind them, asking for their consent, and then acting accordingly. The key to contract variation is in the communication, so how well you deliver your explanation to your employee to start off with. If you do it well, your employee may be happy to sign your new contract, so confirm that in writing, get them to sign their agreement, and that's you done. But if an employee won't agree to vary their contract despite your valid rationale, you need to attempt to resolve their objections. So arrange a meeting with them, discuss their concerns, answer their questions, and consider solutions where possible. Give them some time to think about it, and we suggest you back this up with an email or letter outlining that discussion and asking for consideration to sign the new contract. Hold a follow-up meeting and see if you can finalise things. So try to work with the employee where possible to come to an agreement that suits you both. Also be clear if this is a temporary or a permanent change. There are times when an employee just won't agree. Those employees will need to be invited to a formal consultation and advised that they may be dismissed and offered re-engagement on new terms. They'll have the right to be accompanied at this stage. Now, it can get pretty complicated and there's a high risk of unfair dismissal claims and possibly discrimination claims. So at this point, do seek advice from your HR team before you confirm any dismissal. If you're considering restructuring and the possibility of redundancy, you need to ensure you have a clear rationale behind what you're doing and you follow a fair selection process. We get asked a lot about using redundancy as a way to remove underperforming or poor employees from a business. Now, this is not a legitimate or legal reason for redundancy. Redundancy is purely about the role. So the legal reasons for redundancy are that the employer has ceased or intends to cease business, the work the employee carries out has ceased or diminished, or is expected to do so, or the need to carry out that work at the location they are employed in has ceased or diminished, or is expected to do so. Sometimes the redundancy process can be really straightforward. So you've got one employee doing one role in one location and you don't need that role anymore. But if you've got a team all doing the same role, you need to follow a fair selection process. So I'm just going to talk you through an example of a sales team. So say you've got 10 sales guys who operate in the Northwest, and they do have individual areas, but those areas overlap. And in reality, each of those reps could cover all of the areas. You've decided that you need to reduce staffing costs because your sales team are costing too much money and they're not bringing enough revenue in. So you need to make cuts. You've done your figures and you know you can manage with a team of 8 going forward. And this will ensure that all areas are still covered and there's enough work for everyone. And it will make it easier for your remaining sales team to hit their targets as well. It's tempting to look at some of the more traditional methods, last in, first out, or your face doesn't fit, or you're the youngest, so it's you. But each of these methods is flawed. What if you get rid of your one superstar salesperson just because they were the last to join? What if you're facing an age discrimination tribunal because you chose the youngest person or the oldest person? So this is where a scoring matrix comes in. You would choose 6 to 8 criteria, and this could be based on things like skills, qualifications, ability, performance reviews, targets, attendance, disciplinary record. As long as it's measurable and fair, you can choose the most appropriate criteria. So you need to put your employees at risk of redundancy and then share that selection matrix with them and ask if they think that criteria is fair. You will then set about scoring each individual employee. It might be worth getting more than one person involved in this process if it's not breaching any confidentiality. And you both complete the scoring individually and see if the scores match. This just helps to make sure the scoring isn't clouded by any personal feelings. Take a look at the overall scores and your 2 lowest or highest, depending on which way you've weighted your scoring. Your 2 lowest scoring employees are the 2 you have identified for redundancy. At your next consultation meeting, you need to discuss the employee's individual score with them and ask if they agree. Provided you've got measurable criteria, you should be able to justify any of those scores. You then notify the 2 employees that you've identified for redundancy that you are confirming this and proceed with their dismissal. But don't forget to tell the remaining 8 that they're no longer at risk and have retained their employment. When you're planning your redundancy process, you do need to bear in mind that if you have more than 20 redundancies to make, you must consult for a minimum of 30 days before dismissing. This increases to 45 days if there's more than 100 redundancies. For fewer than 20 redundancies, there's no official consultation length, but we'd advise approximately 2 weeks, although this could be shortened in very simple situations. If your employees are on furlough or flexible furlough, you can still claim the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme grant for notice pay, provided that this is paid as working notice and not pay in lieu of notice, so not as a lump sum. So it's definitely worth planning ahead so that you can reduce your overheads as much as possible. You can also explore enforcing annual leave during the notice period, even if they are on furlough. provided that you give the right notice. Now that's double the time you want them to take. So if you want them to take a week's leave, you have to give 2 weeks notice. We highly recommend keeping employees on furlough for as long as is reasonably possible before confirming that redundancy. The scheme was set up as a way to avoid redundancy, and it's only fair and right to use it in the spirit it was intended. At the start of August, you do start to incur some costs on the coronavirus job retention scheme. So for August, it's just simply that you cannot reclaim your employer's national insurance and pension contributions. In September, you will be expected to contribute 10% towards the wage. So you only have to pay 80% to your employees, but the government will only reimburse you for 70% of that. And in October, they will only reimburse you for 60%. So you need to consider how much you can afford and get the timing right. One last thing about redundancies: reputational damage can be just as bad as the legal recourse of getting it wrong. Redundancies are not pleasant, but if you handle them well and you support your employees, you can hopefully avoid them telling the world what an awful place you are to work. And if you don't believe that this can happen, just think about the recent backlash that Sports Direct and Wetherspoons have had when they've been making redundancies and the way they've treated their staff. That's everything from me. Thank you so much for listening. I really hope that you found this webinar informative. Please do post your questions on the chat if you have any, and we will address them in just a few seconds.